And now I would like to introduce Ambassador Oliver. We're really greatly honored that she could be with us today. President George W. Bush named Ambassador Oliver permanent U.S. representative to the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, known as UNESCO, and Secretary of State Colin Powell swore her in on February 12, 2004. Ambassador Oliver had an illustrious career, even before her appointment to UNESCO, which prepared her for an ambassadorship. First and foremost, she was a wife and mother of 5, which is a major qualification. She was also a noted expert in the fields of education, philanthropy, public policy, and organizational management. Her service in representing the United States at UNESCO was extraordinary. Her ability to combine intelligence, judgment of people, organizational skills, patience, persistence, ability to quickly analyze issues, and hospitality and charm were a winning combination. As a member of the U.S. National Commission to UNESCO, I always look forward to going to Paris to attend ministerial meetings because by working closely with Ambassador Oliver, I knew I was receiving an education in diplomacy and negotiation that I couldn't have learned in books. I discovered that in a relatively short time, she had earned the respect of her peer ambassadors and top UNESCO administrators who learned that if they didn't have a compelling argument or proposition to offer, they would soon have to yield ground to Louise. We are extremely fortunate to have Ambassador Oliver with us today to discuss her experiences at UNESCO and inform us about some of the sticky problems we face in the world today. And now I'll turn it over to Ambassador Oliver.
I don't know how many machines.
I think this will stand up.
That's for Thanks.
Wired up. Thank you, Arden, for that nice introduction, but also thank you for inviting me here to Purdue University, my first visit, I might add, to Purdue. I also want to say that it is a real pleasure and honor for me to serve on the Global Policy Research Institute's External Advisory Council. Although GPRI, I gather that's how we now call it, is still a young institution, it's already clear that with your leadership, it will achieve global recognition and influence just as the National Science Foundation did under your guidance. Speaking of the National Science Foundation, I already knew when I was still ambassador designate, that dreadful period before you have been confirmed, when you have to tiptoe around, be very careful that you don't do something wrong that will derail the entire process. I already knew that NSF was going to play a major role for me and with me at UNESCO. But in fact, when I first got involved with NSF, Rita Colwell was there. And that was because when we officially went back to UNESCO to raise the flag on that series of flagpoles that stand outside the building, and the American flag was going to go up for the first time in 19 years, Mrs. Bush led a delegation over to Paris to celebrate the return. This was the official return October 1st, 2003. On that delegation on which I served was also Rita Colwell. And I had a wonderful time talking to Rita about all kinds of issues and ideas because I knew that we would be doing a lot of science work in the science area at UNESCO. So of course, when we came home a little while later, I called up the National Science Foundation to set up an appointment with Rita. And so over I went on the appointed day, and I arrived to what could only be described as sort of chaos. People carrying furniture here and there, running around. I couldn't figure out what was going on, and I finally found someone, and I said, well, I have an appointment with the director. And they said, you do? I said, yes, I do. Well, it better be quick, because today's her last day. Well, I had no idea she was leaving, and so I was quite appalled. by that and thought, uh-oh, what's going to happen now? Who's going to take her place? I had not at that time had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Brumet. And so it was just an incredibly wonderful experience to discover that the new director of the National Science Foundation was someone with whom I felt great rapport and would work closely with. Now, before I say anything more about UNESCO, I want to just clarify the fact that we're talking about UNESCO, not UNICEF. And I want to clarify that because UNICEF is very well known in the United States. It's the organization that focuses on children's issues. And I have found that people confuse the two, not surprisingly. And certainly after I was confirmed ambassador, I had people thanking me all the time for my service to UNICEF and telling me they loved my Christmas cards and the umbrellas and those little orange boxes that people used to take around on Halloween and collect money. And I would say, well, thank you very much, but that is in fact UNICEF. I am going to UNESCO. And there would be a sort of blank look. But that is what I'm going to discuss today, the United Nations Educational, Cultural, and Science Organization. So now let's turn our attention back to the fall of 1945, just after the end of World War II. Though most people were focused on trying to recover from the horrors of the war, there were individuals, including a number of Americans, already working to find some way to prevent the outbreak of another war in the future. And their efforts led to the founding of UNESCO on November 16, 1945. Now, the preamble of UNESCO's constitution reflects the guiding spirit of the organization, and I quote, "Since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed," unquote. And that wonderful statement was written by the American poet Archibald MacLeish. UNESCO's constitution goes on to say that the purpose of the organization is, and I quote, "to contribute to peace and security by promoting collaboration among nations through education, science, and culture, in order to further universal respect for justice, for the rule of law, and for the human rights and fundamental freedoms which are affirmed for the peoples of the world without distinction of race, sex, language, or religion by the Charter of the United Nations." Noble goals indeed. However, in 1984, only 39 years later, the United States, one of UNESCO's most enthusiastic founding members, withdrew from the organization due to major concerns about the complete lack of financial transparency. At that time, we paid 25% of the dues and did not have any idea where our money was going, and about the politicization which had led to UNESCO initiatives that would have undermined Western ideas and values. But no one expected that it would be almost 2 decades before the US returned to UNESCO. Now, 20 years is a long time. It's a whole generation, which is why most people in the US know very little about UNESCO. And it was not a surprise, therefore, when President George W. Bush announced that the US would rejoin UNESCO in order to promote tolerance, learning, and human rights. And when he announced that, it attracted little attention in the US. But the international community was overjoyed. In fact, President Bush used to say that although he gave 8 speeches at UN General Assemblies during the time he was president, his 2002 announcement about rejoining UNESCO was the only time he ever got any applause. Shortly before I left for Paris, which is where UNESCO is located, which turned out to be a little problem for me when fighting for resources from the State Department. Every time I started to make the argument that I needed something, they'd say, but you're in Paris, as though that answered the question. You need nothing. You're in Paris. But that is where UNESCO is located because it was a deal made when the UN was founded. The French wanted the UN. The Americans said, no, we want the UN. And after a discussion, we got the UN, and second prize was UNESCO. Shortly before I left for Paris, a senior State Department official told me that he hoped I wouldn't be too bored Although he knew that UNESCO worked in education and culture, as well as in science and communication, he did not consider it to be a serious organization dealing with the challenging global issues of today. How wrong he was. In fact, during the 5 years I spent at UNESCO, I found myself engaged in numerous complex and sensitive issues, which included dealing with the Palestinians, Jordanians, and Israelis on problems relating to the Old City of Jerusalem, negotiating with the organization of the Islamic Conference on the crisis that resulted from the publication of the Danish cartoons, dealing with human rights abuses, which included advocating for the release of jailed artists and writers, arguing about the restitution of cultural artifacts back to their countries of origin, and of objects displaced by World War II, as it was very delicately stated. And then there was the crisis of Preah, a group of ancient Khmer civilization temples in Cambodia, even more magnificent than Angkor Wat, that happened to be located on the top of a very large hill on the border with Thailand. After it was voted onto the World Heritage List, fighting broke out on the border, casualties incurred, people killed, and the collapse of the Thai government happened shortly thereafter. And of course, there was the ongoing struggle to promote freedom of the press, especially in countries that do not value freedom of expression, to provide education worldwide, particularly to women and girls, to address the problems of migration, the radicalization of youth, and ethics for scientists, not to mention the creation of the World Digital Library in partnership with the Library of Congress. And I could go on and on and on. Certainly, I was often frustrated, exhausted, exhilarated, worried, overextended, but bored? Never. Though I spent most of my years in Paris in a lovely house located not far from the Seine, the house was not ready when I arrived in Paris in March 2004. Since there had not been an ambassador living there for 20 years, there was a great deal of renovation that had to be done. Therefore, I spent my first 6 months living in an apartment right off the Champs-Élysées. A nice apartment, but it happened to be right across the street from Larry Flint's The Hustler Club, which had a big sign under it saying, "American girls, day and night." I was warned never to be photographed standing under that sign. Of course, there was a great deal of excitement and anticipation when I arrived at UNESCO's headquarters for the first time. But it was also easy to tell that there was a certain amount of concern and even a little fear in UNESCO's corridors. After all, I arrived only 1 year after the US invaded Iraq, a military action strongly opposed by many of UNESCO's 193 member states. And my future colleagues also worried about what role we would play in the organization. Would we lead or dominate? Would we unify the organization or polarize it? Would we be collegial or flaunt our power? Now, I knew more or less what we hoped to achieve at UNESCO. Since Mrs. Laura Bush was serving as the UN ambassador for the literacy decade, it was clear that promoting literacy worldwide, particularly to women and girls, would be one of our top objectives. Protecting natural and cultural heritage through UNESCO's World Heritage Program was another important priority. The US was responsible for establishing that program in 1972, and it was one of the areas that we continued to give voluntary contributions to after we left UNESCO. The US had also continued to give voluntary support to the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission and the International Hydrological Program, both of which are housed at UNESCO. So it's not surprising that science was another one of our top priorities. We wanted to strengthen UNESCO's initiatives in areas such as oceans, tsunami warning systems, clean water, science education, and also to strengthen their programs in engineering, a priority strongly supported by the engineering community in the United States. We saw science and engineering as areas in which the US could provide real leadership at UNESCO. And in order to be credible in that area, I turned to the leading scientists and engineers for help. And let me say that Dr. Mehmet and the National Science Foundation were invaluable in that respect. Plus, as all of you at Purdue know, working with Dr. Mehmet is really, really fun. We also wanted to try and make UNESCO's programs more effective with long-term sustainable results and to promote transparency throughout the entire organization. We hope that these kinds of initiatives would enable the U.S. to start its re-engagement with UNESCO on a positive note. Unfortunately, that was not to be the case. Instead, we spent most of our first year and a half negotiating 3 new international normative instruments, none of which was supported by the United States. There was the Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights that dealt with very sensitive issues, such as social justice and right to life. Thanks to the help of Costa Rica, we managed to keep the issue of cloning out of the declaration. Though a UNESCO declaration is not binding, it is supposed to influence domestic legislation. And then there was the Convention on Anti-Doping in Sport, which was also very, very tricky. And that would be a binding treaty with provisions that would be very difficult for the U.S. to accept, especially given the major role played the U.S. by sports organizations like the National Football League and the National Basketball League. The problem was that there were countries that felt that only signatories to this treaty should be eligible to host world competitions, like the World Cup and the Olympics. And we knew that Chicago wanted to compete for the Olympics. Now, I am not a lawyer, and I had no lawyer on my staff. Although the State Department details lawyers to full-time positions in our New York and Geneva missions, they didn't think the UNESCO mission needed one. But the fact is that UNESCO has the mandate to develop and create new international law, which it does by creating conventions, which is the UNESCO word for treaties. So suddenly, my staff and I found ourselves knee-deep in complex legal documents, begging for support from Washington as we tried to reword those instruments so that as many directives as possible would be voluntary instead of mandatory. Now, the worst of the 3 was the Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. It was vague, with key words like protection and promotion undefined, and no clarity on its relationship to other international obligations, of which the U.S. has numerous ones. And after all, what is a cultural expression? Wine? Foie gras? Coffee? Clothes? That also was undefined. And how does a country protect something without becoming protectionist? We tried to remedy its faults, but failed. No one would talk to us about that convention, and all of our proposed amendments were ignored. In addition to being completely isolated in the negotiations, we lost the vote to approve the convention by 148 to 2. Israel was the only other negative vote. There were 4 abstentions: Australia, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Liberia. This was despite the fact that we had cables from a number of countries stating that they would support us. Now, certainly it would be a gross understatement to say that Washington was very unhappy, especially since that defeat came so soon after our returning to UNESCO. Some officials said that the U.S. should leave UNESCO again. Others advocated freezing funds for the organization. 2 years later, a U.S.-led coalition of more than 70 countries from every part of the globe achieved the unanimous adoption of a resolution on Holocaust remembrance, despite the controversial nature of that resolution. We had also been elected a vice president of UNESCO's 58-member executive board. In only 2 years, the U.S. had gone from isolation and defeat to respected global leader. How did we do that? Well, my staff and I had learned to play the game, the very difficult and very serious game of multilateral diplomacy. Plus, I had finally persuaded the State Department to add a full-time lawyer to our team. Most diplomacy conducted by US diplomats is bilateral, which means they work primarily with the government in whose country they are located. But as part of an intergovernmental organization like UNESCO, we worked with diplomats from all over the world. Every day, I would interact with the Arabs, the Latin Americans, the Africans, the Asians, the Europeans, everyone. And the policy issues were complicated. In addition to countries having their own agendas, geographic regions also had agendas. In order to deal with all these agendas and promote our own priorities, I had to find allies, different groups of allies for each issue. Now, as a non-career ambassador, I had no experience in multilateral diplomacy. Moreover, all of my staff in the US mission had little or no experience in that area. But with help and advice from many of our colleagues at UNESCO and in Washington, hard work, and a lot of good old plain-fashioned common sense, we learned quickly. Among other things, we learned that all countries, big or small, rich or poor, want to be respected, and in particular, to be respected by the richest and most powerful country in the world. Now, to emphasize that point, I made sure that all of my initial getting to know you appointments were held in the offices of my colleagues, not in my big fancy office. Of course, there were advantages to that as well, as there was always something in their offices that I could point to as a way of beginning our conversation. A picture, a book, a piece of sculpture. In one case, I went to see an individual who was from an African country, and he had a most unusual coffee table in his office that was flat for half the table, more or less, before it began to curve upwards, thereby making the other half of the table impossible to use. In responding to my query about his table, he replied that it was a death table, that in his country, the deceased is placed in a semi-sitting position on the table. I don't remember for how long. It took me a moment to recover from that answer, as it was not what I had expected. And I noticed his assistant staring at the table, looking rather horrified. Clearly no one had ever asked about the table before. In any case, the bottom line is that most of the time, if you respect them, they will respect you. And that is the first step towards establishing friendships and ultimately towards exerting leadership. Now, becoming familiar with UNESCO's rules and procedures and its timetables, what we could do and when, was also critical, enabling us to figure out how to advance our initiatives and stop those we didn't like. Getting to know the UNESCO bureaucracy, which included identifying those who were the most influential and effective, was equally important. Simply being big or paying a large percentage of the dues does not automatically lead to success in multilateral diplomacy. And in fact, one of the most powerful individuals at UNESCO was the first secretary of the delegation from the Caribbean island of St. Lucia. Now, that was because she was an expert in all aspects of UNESCO, its history, its politics, everything. And if you had something you wanted to do, you went to her and found out how to do it. She was a power broker, every bit as effective as the always skillful ambassadors from influential countries like Japan, France, and India. Now, effective multilateral diplomacy also requires finding common cause with your colleagues and persuading them to join you in whatever it is you are trying to achieve. After all, it's very hard to be a leader if no one is willing to follow you. For example, the Africans loved our focus on literacy, teacher training, and clean water, which meant that we could always count on their support in those areas. And as a result of working together in areas of mutual concern, we were often able to get them to support us in areas in which they had little interest. Explaining why the US takes the positions it does in international negotiations is also crucial for successful diplomacy. At UNESCO, I learned that most of my colleagues did not really understand American traditions, our culture, our values, our ideas, or how we divide responsibilities between our federal, state, and local governments. For example, I was constantly explaining to them that given our system of government, treaties designed to be implemented by a minister of sport or a minister of culture simply don't work for the US. Now, if other countries don't understand us, they are much more likely to see us as being arbitrary, unreasonable, and uncooperative when we refuse to go along with them during negotiations. It's also very useful to let your colleagues know as soon as possible what your red lines are, what things are that you simply can't compromise on. For us, that would include something like the principle of the freedom of the press. This helps to avoid misunderstandings and allows you to start working with your colleagues to identify mutually acceptable solutions in areas in which you disagree. Now, since much of my work was done during lunches, receptions, and dinners, I also had to learn how to stay on top of my diplomatic game while enjoying numerous glasses of delicious alcoholic beverages. And this was particularly true while socializing with the Russians. Champagne that flowed like water was followed by white wine and red wine and shots of vodka for the non-stop toasts. Now, though I have suggested to the State Department that they add drinking training to the curriculum of its ambassadorial training seminar, thus far, my suggestion has fallen on deaf ears. And finally, as a result of our experience with the Cultural Diversity Convention, we learned that we must never, if possible, let things come to a vote in an organization like UNESCO, where we have one vote out of 193 and no veto. It's not like the United Nations. There is no Security Council. We do not have a veto, which we can rely on when things start going in a direction that make us unhappy. When there are votes, aside from things like membership on committees, the US almost always loses. Now, fortunately, most of the time decisions are made by consensus, although even consensus, that concept can be played with. When I first got there, consensus was defined as unanimity. But for the vote of the Cultural Diversity Convention, it was redefined as overwhelming majority. After the vote on that convention, it went back to being unanimity. So it is a somewhat fluid concept, but most of the time, consensus is the bottom line at UNESCO. That is to prevent explosive votes and divisive things from happening. A recent vote on the issue of UNESCO membership for Palestine is a great example of what happens when there are votes. And it helps explain why I used to describe UNESCO as the soft underbelly of the UN. All eyes have been on the situation in New York, as the Palestinians made an official request that they be accepted as a full member of the United Nations. Now, the US has taken a strong position against that initiative, since we do not recognize Palestine as a state and think it's premature. Instead, the US is encouraging the Palestinians and the Israelis to return to the bargaining table. However, in Paris, UNESCO's executive board just voted to approve a resolution sponsored by a group of Arab states that would grant full membership to Palestine at UNESCO, even though membership in UNESCO as a UN agency is also limited to sovereign states. The vote was 40-4, with 14 abstentions, which included France, Belgium, Italy, and Spain. Though the US joined Germany, Latvia, and Romania in voting against the resolution, without a veto, it cannot stop the Palestinian resolution from moving on for consideration by UNESCO's full membership during its upcoming meeting known as the General Conference. The General Conference means every 2 years. It is the equivalent of the UN's General Assembly. Now, that meeting begins on, guess what? October 25th, today. which is before the issue can be resolved in New York. I can easily imagine the tension that is in Paris today. Part of me wishes I were there, engaged in it all. Part of me is just so grateful that I am not. If the General Conference approves the Executive Board's resolution and grants full membership to Palestine, and I am told that at the moment they do have the votes, and the voting is 2/3 of those attending the meeting. If they do that, it will be the de facto recognition of Palestine as a sovereign state by the international community at UNESCO. And that would probably activate US legislation dating back to the 1990s, Title IV of Public Law 103-336, that requires the US to withhold funds from any UN agency that grants full membership to Palestine. And that would mean no more US funds of any sort, voluntary contributions or dues, could be given to UNESCO. Now, this was recently confirmed by the chairwoman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, who told the Obama administration to, and I quote, "Make it clear that any decision to upgrade the Palestinian mission status by UNESCO or any other UN entity will lead to a cutoff of funds to that entity," unquote. Now, the US currently pays 22% of UNESCO's $643 million budget, approximately $70 million a year. It's not much when you look at Purdue's budget, which is something like almost $2 billion a year. But UNESCO has power that is not related to the size of its budget. It has the power of convening, the power of sovereign governments, the power of mobilizing political will in areas that are deemed to be important. If the US does not pay its dues, it would probably lose its voting rights at UNESCO's 213 General Conference, the one that will take place 2 years from now. And that would certainly lead to calls for the US to withdraw from UNESCO again. So once again, UNESCO is in the eye of the storm. And once again, the US relationship with UNESCO is in jeopardy. So will UNESCO's member states be forced to choose between Palestine and the US? Or will it end up as UNESCO's moments of drama usually end up, which is with an amended resolution that deflects or postpones the crisis in some way? No one knows. And leaving that question hanging in the air, I'd like to thank you for your attention and answer any questions you may have.
Okay, questions, please. Well, while you're thinking of your question, yes, please.
On behalf of the students here at Purdue, I would like to thank you for coming to speak today, as well as last night at President's Leadership class. We really enjoyed your lecture. And you mentioned that the U.S. suffered a huge defeat right after rejoining UNESCO, and an official even suggested withdrawing. My question is, how does someone in your position stay optimistic and resilient even in the face of such negativity and disbelief?
Well, it wasn't easy. Did everyone hear her question? I was, of course, brought back. You did not hear her question? The question was, and I suppose we really should make sure that the microphones are there, but the question was, in the face or the aftermath of the overwhelming vote, it's not easy to lose a vote 148-2. In the face of that, and with the real serious distress of Washington, official Washington, who just could not believe that the states of UNESCO would treat us this way, especially so soon. There were calls, as I said, for the US to either withdraw or to freeze fund or to some way punish them for having done this to us. I was, of course, immediately brought back to Washington, where I immediately began to discuss options. The whole issue of the negotiations on this treaty was difficult because the primary movers and shakers behind it were France and Canada. And that was because of US trade relationships with them in terms of what they were trying to achieve, and they were trying to, the French particularly wanted something called the cultural exception to the WTO. So this was something that was not easy to handle, and the question was, what should we do? But I found in my experience with UNESCO that I had a huge advantage by being the first ambassador in 20 years. And that was that people had to listen to me because they didn't know that much about UNESCO. Normally, when an ambassador gets confirmed, that person goes over to an embassy and takes the place of an ambassador who's already there. The embassy is operational, they just continue what's being done. In my case, I had to build the whole thing from scratch once again. And so they were willing to listen I think with more carefully to what I had to say than they might have otherwise have done. And basically you argue the pros of staying involved in UNESCO. I argued the fact that the attitudes, one of the reasons we went back to the organization was that attitudes toward UNESCO had really changed. In the old days, 20 years prior, the kinds of things that UNESCO dealt with, culture, education, less so the science, that's always been important, were considered soft issues, not really all that significant, not all that important, not like peacekeeping, not like weapons, not like energy, not like some of these really what they would call as hard issues. And I think what changed that opinion was after 2001, 9/11, when there began to be more of a recognition that we couldn't just simply fight terrorists. We had to try and get there early on to start looking at the roots of terrorism. Why do people get radicalized? What can we do in terms of US policy to deal with the circumstances that tend to lead to terrorism? UNESCO was a perfect vehicle for that. And so I think as we began to argue that we really needed UNESCO as much or more than they needed us, that there was a willingness to listen. And there was a willingness to let us try one more time. I think if we had not been able to turn things around the way we did in those 2 years, that there would not have been the patience to let it go on. What is so interesting about the Palestinian issue is here we are. It's 2011. I went back in 2004. It's only 7 years. And already we're in another crisis again. The same argument's going to be discussed. How badly do we need UNESCO? There is the Director General of UNESCO went to Washington to try and persuade the Congress, I think, that perhaps their law ought to be modified. You know the mood in Congress. She didn't do very well on that. So the real action is going to be in Paris. Do the countries of UNESCO want to go back to a time when US was not actively involved, because we will not be able to be actively involved if we are not voting members, paying our dues, and really being engaged? And what they really wanted with the US return was the respect and influence in the international community with the US there. There's no question you can't be a leader in education. You certainly can't be a leader in science or engineering without the US. So they have a really important decision to make, because the issue of Palestine is a real fault line. And as I say, and I've been in touch with our ambassador, I have no idea which way this is going to go.
Next question.
Madam Ambassador, thank you very much for the wonderful story about UNESCO and your role in that, which is admirable, and really it is known to have made a huge difference. In 1945, in the post-war situation, the US found itself with enormous advantage. Less than 5% of the world's population, 50% of the world's wealth was here. And with the help of a lot of prescient, a lot of wise people in Washington, in academia, they built many of the institutions that we take for granted now, such as UNESCO, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations itself. This was a defining moment in modern history, and certainly for the US. It emerges as a power, superpower. And then in 1992, in the early 90s, the end of the Cold War is another defining moment. There was a lot more to celebrate at that time, but very soon the US began to be drawn into hot conflicts. It was no longer hegemony and the balance of power. It was being there, you know, pushing things around and so forth. So one feels that the story of UNESCO precedes, of course, the end of the Cold War, but one feels that some of these institutions that the US built were abandoned or damaged, and there's a lot of mending that needs to be done. And I wonder if now we may be entering a yet new turning cleavage point, the end of the war on terror or something of that sort, that would allow new policies to be put forward, new momentum, maybe see the Middle East not as a backward, antagonistic, bunch of states, but as a region that has the potential to thrive, has huge margins for development, has a wonderful cultural diversity and history, has a lot of educated population. So it's nice to see that the US is not drawn into very hot, on the hot ground in the Arab Spring. It's nice to see that there are new messages coming and there's a lot of hope coming from the region. I wonder if one could see UNESCO as more effective and a new role for UNESCO. It's more effective than the 5th Fleet or the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean and some of the things that we have seen since the end of the Cold War. If you could give us your thought, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, one of the things I tried to do for 5 years was to make UNESCO more effective. I think UNESCO is an important organization, and I would not have accepted that job and worked as hard as I did if I didn't think the rewards were there. The problem with UNESCO, and this is probably more of a problem with UNESCO than some of the other more single-issue UN organizations that deal just with health or food or energy. UNESCO has this unbelievably broad mandate. It does, as I said, all of education, culture, science, communications. So the fundamental problem with UNESCO is that it tries to be all things to all people, doesn't know how to focus, it jumps from issue to issue, it wants to be a player, so it means that, yes, there may be 6 UN agencies already working in energy or renewable energy, but hey, we'll be the 7th. I spent a lot of time trying to say that UNESCO is an important organization. It needs to focus its efforts in areas where it has a comparative advantage. If it goes into energy or into water or into anything else, it should be in a niche, a particular niche that someone else is not doing, another agency is not doing. And we talked about that all the time. Focus, 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 and you all know that in your lives. If you focus on something with persistence and determination, you're more apt to achieve it than if you disperse your energies in lots of different directions. And the problem I ran into, and I guess everyone who's tried to do this has run into, is that where do you cut? Every country at UNESCO sees UNESCO as a vehicle to advance its national interests. It's a political organization. It may sound educational, it may sound cultural, but the fact is it's any organization that consists of the governments of sovereign states is a political organization, using that word as it's meant to be used. And it meant that these different countries all saw UNESCO as a route, as a tool, as a vehicle for accomplishing something they were interested in, which is why we kept adding issue after issue after issue to things that we were dealing with. And then when you have so many different issues that you're dealing with, and you are cutting your budget into so many little pieces, you run into the problem of follow-up. I learned again early on, I learned so many things thanks to my colleagues there, that it did not matter if I made speeches that were wonderful speeches and great oratory and all that sort of thing. None of that made any difference. It disappeared overnight. The only thing that made difference was the written record. And there are two forms of written records. One are the reports of UNESCO meetings, and I made sure that the US was on every single drafting group. It's hard. Dr. Bermet knows only too well because I got him on a couple. And the resolutions that are passed by UNESCO's Executive Board and General Conference. That's the record of action. So it becomes the focus of the activities is to get your resolution written, supported by enough states so it will get passed. If you do that, at least you've got a record that this is an issue you want done. An example being when we we being the United States, wrote a resolution on requiring, and I mean requiring UNESCO to add capacity building training, essentially, into its programs, because so many countries complained about the fact that UNESCO experts would come, they'd deal with a problem, they'd stay a few weeks, a few months, they'd leave, and no time at all, the problem would be right back to where it was in the beginning. So without leaving something behind, knowledge, training, skills, it does not become sustainable. So when we did this, almost overnight, we had 22 co-sponsors. And this resolution roared right on through. And the US was hailed as a hero, gratitude, how wonderful that we were able to do something everyone wanted to do but had never accomplished. But then comes the rub. Does UNESCO actually incorporate capacity building in all its programs? That requires constant vigilance, ongoing vigilance. And very often a resolution will have at the end of it requesting an update or report by the Director General in a year, 2 years, whatever the time period is that is agreed upon. And very often that is, we're working on the problem and we'll report back to you next year. So unless you are very persistent and really stay on top of things, the multitude of issues means that an organization like UNESCO simply will not be effective as we would like it to be. And that's the reality. And until someone does what I wanted them to do, which was obviously unrealistic, but I said, let's go into zero-based budgeting. We do budgets every 2 years, they do. So throw it all out and say, okay, what's the UNESCO priority? If it's education, which is what every country said their top priority was, okay, let's put 30%, 40% of UNESCO's budget into that. What's the second priority? Science, whatever, put it in that. In other words, have our funds follow our priorities, and then we will actually accomplish something worthwhile. And the other things, though they may be important, they may be valuable, there are lots of other places that can do them, lots of them. So let UNESCO focus on what it can do best, using its comparative advantage, and basically offload the others and say these are great, but someone else will have to pick them up.
Well, Ambassador Oliver, I have a small token of appreciation. I had.
Grab it.
I'm going to stand back.
It may be in pieces by now. But we're very grateful that you took time to be with us today and to pass on your words of wisdom and your experiences in UNESCO. It's, if we had time, and I'll ask this question out in the Commons, there are non-career diplomats and there are career diplomats. And many nations that are part of UNESCO actually use career diplomats for that service. And I was curious to know if there are advantages in being a non-career diplomat.
I will answer that quickly before we go to the comments because it is a wonderful question. Yes, most countries could not understand that someone outside the foreign ministry, outside the professional service, would actually be designated as an ambassador, not just to UNESCO, but we have lots of non-career ambassadors. I traveled around a lot, and I always asked to see the ambassador in the countries I was traveling in. I had to do it because of the fact the State Department is organized in cones, the European desk, the Asian desk, the African desk, etc. And those rarely talk to each other. So I just ignored that, and my bureau was the Bureau of International Organization Affairs, and I would simply call up the ambassador, our ambassador to Egypt, or our ambassador to Jordan, or our ambassador to wherever I was going, and say, I want a briefing from you on your country. And the reason I wanted that was the more I understood about the country, the more I understood about the agenda of that country and how they were going to play it through UNESCO, the more forewarned I was in terms of being able to deflect, change, deal, do whatever I had to do. And in my travels, I had no idea whether an ambassador I was visiting was a non-career ambassador or a career ambassador, and I could have cared less. That was totally irrelevant. What I discovered was that they were fantastic career ambassadors and clueless ones, and they were fantastic non-career and equally clueless ones. There was no relationship on whether an ambassador was good or not. But the advantage of a non-career ambassador, and I think it's particularly true in an ambassadorship where you are really hands-on public policy. In many of the bilateral ambassadorships, you really are, everything is scripted. You get your instructions, take this note to the senior official in the government, or you are helping promote visitors, trade missions and things in your country. At an intergovernmental organization, you really are in the hands-on policy-making world. I had to deal, as I said, with all these different issues, become an instant expert, and then find out who in Washington, who I needed to call on to stand next to me in order to give me the credibility and knowledge I needed. But the real advantage was the fact that my next job did not depend on what I did as ambassador. For the career ambassadors, absolutely, and it's true also of your foreign service officers, there's such a thing as corridor talk. And I learned early on that if I wanted to hire someone, because I did do some hiring, which I got very personally involved in, I always said to one of my staff, check out the corridor talk. That meant find out what's not on the CV. Well, the trouble of that is that corridor talk and that people's reputations follow them. If they were controversial somehow, if they made a decision that wasn't liked or whatever it is, these can come back to haunt them as they try and climb the ladder, maybe even prevent them from becoming an ambassador someday, which is, of course, the goal of almost every foreign service officer. But me, I would spend my days in Paris, getting up, going from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting, and then you would go to 2 or 3 receptions, and then you'd go to a dinner, come back to 11 o'clock. Then the action would begin with Washington, because of course they were still in their offices, 6 hours behind. It was only 5 o'clock. So then you would start discussing policy. I just got this email saying, you want me to do this? Well, that's ridiculous. That's not going to work at UNESCO. That doesn't make sense. So then I would proceed to discuss what a different policy might look like and why I thought I had to defend my positions. Why I thought this didn't work. Again, I knew more about UNESCO. I knew more about the individual ambassadors, who I could rely on and who I could not. I had to have my allies. As I said, I didn't have a veto. So I had to be able to have guidance that I thought would actually succeed. So I was able to argue and discuss until they finally said, okay, all right, whatever. I don't think I would have been able to do that, certainly not as effectively, if I had thought that my next job might depend on who I was arguing with. And I have no doubt there were probably some who thought, when is that woman going to leave? How long are we stuck having to deal with this ambassador? But in the end, it made for much better policy, because in the end, we, and I mean the State Department, people in the State Department who were in the office I was dealing with, some of whom were fantastic, really good. We learned to respect each other's opinions. They knew things I didn't know. I'm a non-career ambassador. They had experience in areas I didn't have experience in. They had some breadth of vision and some ideas that were very, very valuable for me. And me, I came in with a different point of view, a different background, different experiences. So we ended up being a very, very strong and positive team. And I think that is one reason why, in the end, the experience at UNESCO was a very positive one. Not just for me, but for the United States.
Thank you very much, Louise. All of you are invited to join us in the Commons for a reception, and Ambassador Oliver will be there if you would like to discuss any of your questions or any issues with her. And thank you very much for attending.
This is great.